Welcome back to Pop Goes the 60s. I'm Matt Williamson, and today I'm going to continue with my Beatle album reviews. And today we're going to be looking at the Beatles 65, released December 15th, 1964. Now this is basically the US version of Beatles For Sale, and I just did a review on this one. This is a much more substantial album, many more tracks, 14 tracks to 11 here on Beatles 65. And Beatles 65 was basically the North American counterpart, released mainly in the US and Canada. Big hit. It actually jumped from the number 98th spot on Billboard's Top 200 Albums list to number 1 in 1 week. That was the largest jump in the history at that time. And it was number 1 for 9 weeks in the United States. What's interesting, having been released in mid-December of 64, this was the top-selling non-soundtrack album of 1965, if you can believe it. And if you look at the list of soundtracks that were coming out in the 60s, quite a lot, and they were very popular, very big sellers, some of these blockbuster movies. And those were the days when they actually created music for soundtracks, for films, original music. So that was always stiff competition for other pop groups. And by the end of 1965, this album had sold nearly 2 million copies in the United States alone, about 100,000 copies in Canada. When we talk about the United States releases of early Beatle albums, it's impossible to not talk about the difference between the UK versions, and they always had less tracks. And this is one of the main criticisms against these albums. The other one is the sound, because Capitol did some tinkering with the sound, which we'll talk about in a moment. But this album only has 11 tracks on it. And originally, the first couple United States albums, namely Introducing the Beatles, which was not a Capitol release, and Meet the Beatles, those each had 12 tracks. But since then, the albums were down to 11. So they're getting a little more stingy here in the United States. And this album was really built from a couple different albums, not just Beatles For Sale, but there was 8 songs from Beatles For Sale, 1 song from A Hard Day's Night that was unused for the US release Something New, inexplicably, and both sides of the current single, which is I Feel Fine and She's a Woman. Now, obviously, when the US gets their hands on these Beatle tracks and kind of slaps together a US version, they have the opportunity to do whatever track listing they like. Now, on this album, one thing I didn't talk too much about was the track listing. I focused mostly on the fact there were a lot of covers. There are 8 originals and 6 covers. And one of the things I thought was somewhat problematic, even in this album, was what I call the Lennon trilogy: No Reply, I'm a Loser, and Babies in Black. That starts off side 1, and I just think clumping those together, they're too alike. I prefer to offer a little more variety, and there's a bad track listing can really doom an album. I mean, proper track listing can make the listen be very special. And I think Beatles For Sale lacked that good track listing. Here on Beatles 65, despite having those 3 Lennon tracks starting off the album, this track listing isn't that bad. And I hate to admit it, but when I listen to this, 11 tracks in all, it feels a little more cohesive than the British counterpart.
I know that you saw me of all the love I have won or have lost. She sees the mistake she has made. What could be rock roll music if you wanna dance with me? You look to see I've gone, Mr. Moonlight.
When talking about Beatles For Sale, I mentioned the quality of some of these covers as not being up to scratch, not at the usual high standards the Beatles used. The couple that you just heard on side 1 here, Rock and Roll Music and Mr. Moonlight, I mean, a lot of people like these songs. So, and when people grew up, and just like anybody else, when we're young and this is the new album and we're soaking it all in, the track order, the running order kind of burns in our mind, so it sounds right to us. So to many of you, I'm sure a lot of these track listings sound right. Me, having come up, well, obviously I came up a little later and had albums to listen to in the order that everybody else did prior to me. But in this whole computer age, when you're able to shuffle everything, things start to get a little bit away from the original running order. So I do actually think, even though the covers on here aren't as strong, and the covers that are on this album are Rock and Roll Music, Mr. Moonlight, Honey Don't, and Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, I think they hold together better, and maybe it is because there are less tracks.
Well, how come you say you will when you won't? Say you do, baby, when you don't. 'Cause I told you once before goodbye. My love don't give me presents.
Now, I would never lead off an album side with Honey Don't, but that happens on side 2. And we see that She's a Woman and I Feel Fine, both sides of the recent single, are put next to each other on the end of this album, and Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby closes. Those 3 songs kind of work together. They're sonically similar with all that reverb. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But this album, the Beatles 65 version, seems to rock harder than Beatles For Sale because it's got the single on that. And I think that's one of the appeals to Beatles 65. So one of the songs that they did leave off of these sessions, and I forgot to mention it in the Beatles For Sale, was Leave My Kitten. The song had been recorded and was just a cover that I guess could have been put on any one of these albums and was just left off for some reason. And I think that might have been a better option than Honey Don't or Mr. Moonlight. But that's not how it went. So they gave us what they gave us. And let's talk a little bit about the single, because growing up as a kid, I didn't have the British versions with the exception of Rubber Soul. So when I heard the British version of I Feel Fine and She's a Woman, what the hell happened to these songs? I mean, the thing I liked about the original I Feel Fine and She's a Woman is they sound dirtier and grittier and just more powerful than the UK mixes. And that's something I grew up with. So that is my preferred listen. I know some people don't like the reverb. I think the only people that don't like that would be people who didn't grow up with that. So I think that reverb, along with Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, which is already very echoey, that kind of works together, closing the album. And this album, I think, has a lot of energy and packs a really good punch. Now, one thing that doesn't pack a good punch with is the art direction. And as I mentioned in the prior video on Beatles For Sale, we have a wonderful photograph here, one of the best album covers. The only reason this isn't more known is because it didn't grace the cover in the United States. And the photographer is Robert Freeman. And Freeman had done With the Beatles, Meet the Beatles in the States. He did this cover, he did Rubber Soul. So he was one of their main photographers during this period. And as I mentioned, people talk about, this, oh, look at how tired they are. They didn't have enough energy to do more originals. They were every bit as much busy as when they were doing A Hard Day's Night, which had all originals, by the way. So this photograph to me is just a picture that is very artistic looking, and the Beatles want to be taken seriously. And they are not smiling on the With the Beatles cover, nor are they smiling on the Rubber Soul cover, but nobody says the Beatles are tired on either of those covers. Now on this cover, we have this photo session, which I think are actually very good photos. The problem is why would you slap 4 photos on the cover of the Beatles album? This to me is just poor art direction. If I was teaching an album cover designing class in the 60s, I would say this is what you don't do. So why not have this be the main cover over the whole thing, or any one of these? These are not bad photos. But this is just what I call the slack art direction of Capitol. And even the construction of their albums, they always had some kind of white border around that. Actually, I think I've got it. Hold on a second. As long as I'm bringing it up, might as well pull it out. I pulled one out because it looked cleaner. Give me a moment here, folks. Ay, ay, ay. Okay, here we go. So here is what normally the albums normally look like in America, which had this white border across 3 sides. And this is just the slick being put over white cardboard, essentially, or just having a border here. And I just think that's kind of cheesy. I prefer what's called a full bleed photo. That just looks more classy. Well, like this. And just a comparison between the Beatles For Sale and the cover artwork and this nice gatefold. At least you have some nice liner notes here, and the breakdown of the songs are all here with who's singing what. You've got some additional photography here. It's a gatefold. With Beatles 65, we get nothing of the sort. We get some cheesy hype on the back. The Beatle fans knew all along. You knew that the Beatles really do have a style and sound like they've never been before. You know, it's just really cheesy. You've got all these other, they're hyping all these other album covers on the back. It's very clean, but even the title Beatles 65 leaves something to be desired. Total lack of imagination. And this was not the only album of the year that was named 65 of some sort. We have the album Sinatra 65 by Frank Sinatra, Ellington 65 by Duke Ellington, and Brazil 65 by Sergio Mendes. Not original at all, which is completely the antithesis of what we expect from our Beatles. I had mentioned I Feel Fine and She's a Woman, the single that went along with this album, as being done in duophonic sound. Now, duophonic, that term was a capital term, it was a trademark term that they used for essentially creating fake stereo. And this was common. I don't know why they didn't bother to get some of the stereo masters, which they could have easily got. I don't know why they did that, but they did it that way. I think they were just trying to make it sound more American with the echo anyway, so maybe that just differentiating the sound enough from the British counterparts. But let me read to you what duophonic actually is. So this was done by splitting the mono signal into two channels, then delaying one channel signal by means of delay lines and other circuits, i.e. desynchronizing the two channels by fractions of a second, and cutting the bass frequencies in one channel with a high-pass filter, then cutting the treble frequencies in another channel with a low-pass filter. The result was an artificial stereo effect without giving the listener true directional sound characteristic of real stereo. So that's a mouthful. But that's what a lot of the early mixes of the United States albums sounded like. And to me, I always thought they're not unlistenable to me. Some of them I do prefer because they do sound more punchy in some instances. And no amount of bad mixing can really destroy a great song. So to me, I'm always more about the song, and you know, the mixes are they're just there, and they're just were at the time a necessary evil, and they're left for us there now to debate which is better. And then we've got, of course, got the remixes, which makes it even more complicated and more convoluted. But this album, I think, really benefits from having the single on it. It makes this album much more strong. Let me just read a couple of reviews from the record at the time that came out. One from Rolling Stone Record Guide. This was done in 1983 by John Swenson. He described Beatles 65 as the first of the band's classic concept albums. Not sure what concept he's talking about, although I did mention when reviewing this album, there was kind of a country western feel, and John Lennon even said as much. So maybe that's what he's referring to. I don't really find too much of a concept here, other than maybe, you know, some of the songs, the originals, particularly I'll Follow the Sun, Babies in Black, No Reply, I'm a Loser. Those are all a little bit of a negative tone, a little more introspective with that Dylan feel. So maybe that's what he's referring to. But I would say that these albums are quite different in sound and feel, even though there's 8 similar tracks. So they are extremely different to my ears. And if you're a Beatle collector, I mean, I don't know what to suggest. I guess you just go with which one you like. Obviously, the standardization of the CDs in the mid-80s made this the de facto accepted copy worldwide. And but it's still nice to dip our toes into the very thick reverb and duophonic mixes that Dave Dexter provided us back in those early mid-60s. So anyway, that is my little review on Beatles 65, and still pretty. They sold millions of them, so they're not, the originals are still easy to find. I had pulled out one of my Apple versions here because I have all of the, I've got a full collection all on Apple label, I think, or darn close to it. So that's just one of my little things I like to do. but generally speaking, you'll find this on the Rainbow Capital. So if you like this review, I've got plenty more on the Beatles, and if you like to support this channel, I've hit that subscribe button, and I've got a couple of options below if you want to support this channel in a bigger way. As always, I thank you for watching. Pop goes the 60s.
No reply.